Behind the gilded crowns and royal proclamations of medieval Europe lay a world of whispered secrets, where power wasn't always won on the battlefield. Sometimes it was claimed in the dim light of a queen's private chambers. Picture this, a time when kingdoms rose and fell not just by the sword, but by the cunning of women who ruled from the shadows. These queens weren't just figureheads, they were master strategists, pulling strings with a deftness that history often forgets to mention. What if everything you thought you knew about medieval power was only half the story? Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, who defied two kings and shaped the destiny of empires, or Isabella of France, who orchestrated a coup against her own husband. These weren't just women of their time, they were architects of their time, wielding influence in ways that textbooks barely scratch the surface of. Think of the alliances sealed not with treaties, but with stolen glances across candlelit tables, the coded messages hidden in embroidery, the poison slipped into a rival's cup during a feast. The medieval court was a chessboard, and the queens, they were always several moves ahead. But why don't we hear more about their stories? Perhaps because history prefers its heroes loud and its heroines silent. Yet the truth is far more fascinating. Behind every throne, there was a woman calculating, persuading, surviving. This isn't just about reclaiming their legacies, it's about uncovering the pulse of an era that thrived on secrets. So let's step into the corridors of power where the real games were played, where a whispered word could topple a dynasty, and where the most dangerous weapon wasn't a blade but a queen's unshakable will. Ready to meet the women who didn't just wear crowns, they rewrote history. History remembers the warriors and kings, but what of the queens who ruled when no one was looking? Take Urraca of León and Castile, a name you won't find in many history books. Crowned in her own right in the 12th century, she didn't just inherit a throne, she defended it through civil wars, outmaneuvering rebellious nobles and even her own husband who tried to seize her power. Chroniclers of the time dismissed her as tempestuous, but the truth, she was a political genius holding fragile kingdoms together while men wrote her off as emotional. Then there's Tamar of Georgia, the only woman to ever rule the medieval Georgian Empire outright. She didn't just reign, she expanded borders, crushed invasions, and presided over a golden age of art and literature, all while her male contemporaries insisted a woman couldn't lead an army. But here's the twist, many of these queens were erased not by accident but by design. Male scribes often portrayed them as villains or distractions, their real achievements buried under scandalous rumors. Take Joan of Navarre, accused of witchcraft by her stepson when he needed an excuse to seize her treasury. Or Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, who led armies against Viking invaders yet was sidelined in chronicles that gave credit to her brother. These weren't just omissions, they were deliberate acts of historical silencing. So why does it matter? Because every time we uncover one of these stories, the medieval world gets more interesting. It wasn't just a brutal patriarchy, it was also a place where women found cracks in the system and wielded power in ways we're still discovering. Behind every rewritten chronicle, there's a queen who refused to be forgotten. And that changes everything. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just break the mold, she shattered it with a defiance that echoed across centuries. As the only woman to lead a crusade, she rode horseback to Jerusalem in the mid-12th century, draped not in silks but in chainmail, commanding her own vassals as a feudal lord in her own right. Forget the damsel in distress, this was a queen who negotiated with Byzantine emperors, outmaneuvered treacherous allies, and reportedly kept pace with hardened knights on the grueling march east. And when her first marriage to King Louis VII of France crumbled, she didn't fade into obscurity. She strategically divorced him, reclaimed her vast lands, and within weeks married Henry Plantagenet, the future King of England, turning her into the most powerful woman in Europe. But Eleanor's real masterstroke, playing the long game. When her husband Henry II tried to sideline her, she didn't retreat, she trained her sons like chess pieces. Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey, and young John weren't just heirs, they were her weapons. Fed up with Henry's tyranny, Eleanor secretly backed their rebellion, turning her court at Poitiers into a war room where troubadours sang coded ballads of revolt. She wasn't just a mother pleading for her children's rights. She was a tactician exploiting Henry's greatest weakness, his own family. When the rebellion failed, Henry imprisoned her for 16 years, yet even locked away, her influence seeped through the cracks. Her sons never forgot who'd fought for them first. Here's what the chroniclers missed. Eleanor wasn't reckless. Every act of defiance was calculated. While monks painted her as a shrew or seductress, her real crime was refusing to be irrelevant. She turned the courtly love poetry of her youth into political propaganda, using art to soften her image while ruling with iron pragmatism. By the time she emerged from captivity, white-haired and steel-spined, she'd outlived Henry and ruled as regent for Richard, crushing rebellions with the same cool precision she'd honed decades earlier. The lesson: in a world that demanded queens be decorative, Eleanor proved they could be downright dangerous. Poitiers wasn't just a refuge for Eleanor of Aquitaine, it became a revolution. After years of stifling royal marriages and political schemes, she transformed her ancestral court into something utterly radical. A salon where love wasn't just whispered about in secret, but celebrated as an art form. Imagine a room flickering with candlelight, filled with troubadours strumming lutes, their songs spinning tales of passion and heartbreak. This wasn't mere entertainment, it was a political statement. Eleanor's court of love turned the rigid rules of medieval marriage on their head, championing the idea that desire could be noble, that women had the right to choose or refuse their lovers. In a world where noble women were traded like chess pieces, her court dared to ask, what if a queen's heart mattered as much as her crown? The troubadours who flocked to Poitiers weren't just musicians, they were propaganda machines. Their lyrics painted Eleanor as the muse of a new chivalry, where knights served ladies not out of duty but devotion. Songs like those of Bernard de Ventadorn wove her into myth, comparing her to a distant, unattainable star, a clever metaphor for her unbreakable autonomy. But beneath the poetry lay a sharper purpose. By romanticizing female agency, Eleanor was rewriting the script of power. If a lady could command a knight's loyalty in song, why not a queen's authority in court? Even her daughter Marie of Champagne took up the mantle, presiding over love tribunals where noble women judged disputes over romance, turning courtly love into a kind of social experiment. Yet the court of love was more than just subversion, it was survival. Eleanor knew that culture could bend politics. By making her court the epicenter of art and romance, she ensured that poets, not just warlords, shaped her legacy. When her husband Henry II later imprisoned her, those same troubadours kept her legend alive, their ballads smuggled out of castle dungeons like secret letters. The irony: while chroniclers dismissed her as a frivolous patron of love songs, those very songs became her shield and her sword. Long after her death, the ideals she fostered in Poitiers would ripple through history, shaping everything from Dante's Divine Comedy to modern notions of romance. The court of love proved one thing: in a world of steel and blood, the soft power of a queen's imagination could be the most dangerous force of all. Isabella of France was called a she-wolf by her enemies, but history's judgment often misses the sharp cunning beneath the label. Married off at just 12 to England's King Edward II, she arrived as a pawn in a political alliance only to become the hand that toppled the board. Edward's reign was a disaster: favoritism toward his unpopular courtiers, military failures, and a kingdom teetering on rebellion. While most queens would have suffered silently, Isabella saw an opening. When Edward sent her to France on a diplomatic mission in 1325, she didn't negotiate peace. She raised an army. With her lover, Roger Mortimer, by her side, Isabella became the architect of her husband's downfall. She spun her defiance as patriotism, declaring she'd return to rid England of the tyrant. The people rallied to her not just because they despised Edward's misrule, but because she mastered the art of perception. Chroniclers, often hostile to powerful women, painted her as a vengeful adulteress, yet they couldn't ignore her strategic brilliance. She cut off Edward's support by forgiving the debts of angry barons, turned London's merchants against him with promises of fair trade, and even secured the tacit backing of the church. By the time her forces reached England, Edward had few allies left, but Isabella's most audacious move was framing her coup as a moral crusade. She dressed her son, the future Edward III, in armor and paraded him as the kingdom's true hope, a living symbol of legitimacy. When Edward II was forced to abdicate, it wasn't Isabella who seized power, it was her teenage son, with her pulling the strings from the shadows. For 3 years, she and Mortimer ruled as regents, proving a woman could wield power even when the throne wasn't technically hers. The propaganda against her, though, was relentless. Monks wrote of her unnatural ambition, while ballads mocked her relationship with Mortimer. Yet beneath the scandalous tales lay a deeper fear, a queen who refused to be controlled. When her son, Edward III, eventually turned on her, executing Mortimer and confiscating her lands, it wasn't just a son rebelling against his mother, it was the patriarchy reasserting itself. Isabella's legacy was buried under centuries of scorn, but the truth remains. In a world where queens were meant to kneel, she chose to conquer. Isabella's grip on power wasn't just built on armies and alliances, it was forged in the ledgers of Europe's wealthiest bankers. While her husband Edward II floundered under England's crushing debts, she turned finance into a weapon. The key, the Lombard banking families, Italian moneylenders who held the purse strings of kings. Where Edward had alienated them with defaults and confiscations, Isabella courted them with ruthless pragmatism. She secured loans to fund her invasion, not with promises of repayment, but with something far more valuable: royal favors. Tax exemptions, trading privileges, even control over England's wool trade, the lifeblood of the economy, were bartered for gold, but her most audacious move came after seizing power. Needing to stabilize a bankrupt kingdom, Isabella didn't just borrow, she reshaped the system. Chroniclers gasped when she appointed Lombard financiers to key treasury posts, effectively outsourcing England's finances to foreigners. To the nobility, it was scandalous. To Isabella, it was genius. These bankers weren't just creditors, they were shadow diplomats. Their networks stretched from Paris to Constantinople, allowing her to manipulate trade routes, stranglehold rival economies, and even spy on exiled enemies through their merchant contacts. Yet the real scandal lay in the wool. By granting Lombard syndicates monopolies over England's most lucrative export, Isabella turned fleeces into political leverage. When Flemish cities hesitated to support her regime, she simply diverted wool shipments, crippling their textile industries until they capitulated. Even her detractors couldn't deny the results. Within 2 years, she'd have the crown's debt while filling her war chests. The backlash, though, was inevitable. Rumors swirled that she'd sold the kingdom to coin-clipping foreigners, and when her son Edward III finally wrested control, his first act was expelling the Lombard bankers, a populist stunt that conveniently erased his mother's debts. But the truth lingered like ink on a ledger. Isabella hadn't just played the game of power, she'd rewritten its rules, proving that in medieval politics, gold could topple thrones far faster than swords. Margaret of Anjou didn't just watch the Wars of the Roses unfold, she waged them with a ferocity that left contemporaries stunned. While most queens were expected to pray quietly as men fought, Margaret strapped on armor and rode into battle, not as a symbolic figurehead but as a field commander. Her enemies mocked her as the Frenchwoman, but they underestimated her ruthless brilliance. When her husband, Henry VI, slipped into madness, leaving England vulnerable, and their son's inheritance hung by a thread, Margaret didn't wait for knights to save the throne. She became the storm. The year 1460 saw her pull off a military masterstroke. With Henry captured by the Yorkists and their forces scattered, Margaret raised an army in the north, rallying Lancastrian loyalists with a mix of charisma and cold calculation. She didn't just inspire, she orchestrated. At the Battle of Wakefield, her tactics turned the tide, luring the arrogant Duke of York out of his stronghold with feigned retreats, then crushing his forces in a brutal ambush. Chroniclers gasped when she ordered York's severed head displayed atop the city gates, crowned with a paper diadem. This wasn't just vengeance, it was psychological warfare, a warning to anyone who dared challenge her son's birthright. But Margaret's true genius lay in her ability to turn weakness into strength. Penniless and exiled in France after early defeats, she didn't beg for mercy, she bartered. Offering the strategic port of Calais as collateral, she secured troops from the French king, then landed in England like a thunderclap. At the Battle of Tewkesbury, she directed maneuvers personally, her banners fluttering alongside generals. When the fight was lost and her teenage son cut down on the field, even her enemies noted her eerie composure. Grief would come later, survival came first. The propaganda machine of the victorious Yorkists painted her as a hysterical foreigner, but the records tell a different story. Letters show her negotiating troop movements, securing supply lines, and even overriding seasoned commanders when their caution clashed with her urgency. In an era that saw queens as pawns, Margaret played chess, sacrificing pieces but never conceding the game. Her ultimate failure wasn't due to lack of skill, it was the sheer weight of a system stacked against her. Yet even in defeat, she left an indelible mark, proof that a queen could wage war as fiercely as any king, and that motherhood, when wielded as a weapon, could shake empires. The smear campaign against Margaret of Anjou wasn't just petty court gossip, it was a calculated demolition of her political legitimacy. The moment she stepped onto the battlefield, her enemies knew they couldn't defeat her with swords alone. So they weaponized her womanhood. Yorkist propagandists spread whispers that her son, Prince Edward, wasn't the king's heir at all, but the bastard child of Margaret's alleged lover, the Duke of Somerset. Never mind that the dates didn't add up, or that Henry VI himself never doubted the boy's paternity. The goal wasn't truth, it was chaos. If Margaret's child could be painted as illegitimate, the entire Lancastrian claim to the throne would crumble. But the rumors didn't stop there. In taverns and church pulpits, a darker narrative took hold, that Margaret dabbled in dark arts to control her feeble husband. Pamphlets circulated describing her as a sorceress who'd enchanted Henry into madness, a trope straight from medieval misogyny's playbook, the irony. These same critics who accused her of witchcraft were the ones who'd mocked Henry's weakness until Margaret stepped in to compensate for it. Suddenly, a queen's competence was evidence of supernatural corruption. Even her French heritage was twisted into proof of treachery, with ballads painting her as a foreign spider spinning webs to ensnare England. Yet the most damaging smears weren't the outlandish ones, they were the subtle, plausible lies. Chroniclers like the Yorkist sympathizing a rival of Edward IV meticulously depicted her as bloodthirsty, emphasizing her glee at the deaths of enemies while glossing over her strategic brilliance. They recast her military pragmatism as feminine hysteria, her battlefield commands as irrational rages, and it worked. By the time she fled into exile, Margaret's reputation was so thoroughly poisoned that later historians would repeat these tropes for centuries without question. Here's what her detractors missed: the very ferocity of their attacks betrayed their fear. A queen who could raise armies, outmaneuver seasoned lords, and turn the tide of war was dangerous precisely because she defied every expectation. The smear campaign wasn't just about destroying Margaret, it was about sending a message to any woman who might follow her. Rule like a king, and history would make sure you paid the price. Matilda of Tuscany didn't just inherit land, she inherited a war. In the 11th century, as the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV clashed with Pope Gregory VII over who had the right to appoint bishops, Europe teetered on the brink of chaos. This wasn't just a theological debate, it was a power struggle that would define an era, and Matilda, a noblewoman ruling vast territories in northern Italy, became the Pope's unlikely sword and shield. While other lords waffled or bowed to imperial pressure, she stood firm, her castles becoming the Pope's strongholds and her armies his last line of defense. The investiture controversy boiled down to a single explosive question. Did kings or popes hold the authority to crown God's ministers? Henry IV insisted it was his divine right as emperor. Gregory, a reformer, declared the church must be free from royal interference. When Henry retaliated by declaring the Pope deposed, Gregory excommunicated him, a spiritual death sentence that turned the emperor into an outcast. But excommunication alone couldn't enforce the Pope's will. That's where Matilda stepped in. With her strategic lands controlling the mountain passes between Germany and Rome, she could choke off Henry's access to Italy or open the gates for his enemies. Their most famous showdown came at Canossa in 1077. Desperate to lift his excommunication, Henry crossed the Alps in midwinter, a humiliating pilgrimage to beg Gregory's forgiveness. What's often forgotten is that he didn't find the Pope in Rome. He found him in Matilda's castle. For 3 days, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow outside her walls, a spectacle staged under Matilda's watchful eye. She wasn't just hosting Gregory, she was controlling the narrative. By forcing Henry to kneel, she and the Pope turned his surrender into a propaganda victory that echoed across Christendom. But Matilda's role went far beyond symbolism. When Henry inevitably broke his promises and invaded Italy, it was her forces that harried his troops, cutting supply lines and ambushing his vanguard. She funded Gregory's campaigns, leveraged her network of spies, and even outmaneuvered Henry politically by marrying a Bavarian duke to secure German allies. At a time when women were excluded from warfare and diplomacy, she excelled at both, proving that a ruler's strength wasn't determined by gender but by strategy. The chroniclers of her time struggled to reconcile her power with their worldview. Some painted her as a pious Amazon, a warrior saint. Others whispered that her loyalty to Gregory must have been romantic, because how else could a woman command such influence? The truth was simpler and far more subversive. Matilda understood that in the game of thrones and altars, conviction paired with steel won more battles than brute force alone. Long after her death, her legacy endured not just as the Pope's protector, but as proof that even in the Middle Ages, the pen and the sword could be wielded by the same unexpected hand. Matilda's castles weren't just stone and mortar, they were a chessboard sprawled across the Italian peninsula, each fortress a calculated move in her game of power. From the Apennine Mountains to the Po River Valley, she commanded a network of over 100 strongholds, their placements so precise they formed an invisible web of control. Take Canossa, her crown jewel, perched atop a sheer cliff in Emilia-Romagna. Its walls weren't just defensive, they were psychological. Visitors had to navigate a spiraling path under the gaze of archers, a visceral reminder of who held the upper hand. When Emperor Henry IV arrived to beg the Pope's forgiveness, he didn't just kneel in the snow. He did it beneath Matilda's battlements, a spectacle designed to humiliate. But Canossa was only the beginning. To the north, her castle at Bianello guarded the vital Caesar Pass, the funnel through which German armies had to march to reach Rome. Control it, and Matilda could choke off imperial reinforcements or swing the gates wide for Henry's enemies. Further south, the fortress of Monteveglio loomed over trade routes to Bologna, its taxes filling her coffers while its garrison kept rebellious cities in check. This wasn't random real estate, it was a masterclass in geographic strategy. Every river crossing, every mountain pass had a Matilda stronghold, turning the very landscape into her ally. Her secret: she didn't just inherit these castles, she rebuilt them. At Carpinte, she added concentric walls and hidden cisterns, innovations that let garrisons withstand sieges for months. At Sermine on Lake Garda, she fortified the peninsula so thoroughly it became an island of loyalty in a sea of imperial sympathizers. And then there was the Pièce de Résistance, her shadow castles. These were smaller, camouflaged outposts, often just enhanced watchtowers manned by skeleton crews who could light signal fires at the first sign of enemy movement. When Henry's troops marched, Matilda knew before they'd crossed the border. The genius of her system lay in its flexibility. Unlike male lords who hoarded their keeps as symbols of personal glory, Matilda treated hers like a network. She loaned castles to allies as rewards, rotated garrisons to prevent defections, and even gifted a few to the church, earning papal favor while outsourcing their defense. When Henry's forces took one stronghold, 3 more would rise in rebellion behind his lines. By the time he'd quelled them, Matilda's diplomats had already peeled away his allies. What's often overlooked is how she used architecture as propaganda. Her castles weren't just functional, they were statements. At Canossa, she built a chapel dedicated to St. Apollonius, a martyr who defied Roman emperors, a nun too, subtle parallel to her own defiance. Frescoes in her halls depicted biblical heroines like Judith, the widow who beheaded a tyrant. Even the act of construction sent a message. While Henry's reign faltered, Matilda's walls rose higher. The lesson: in an era when women weren't supposed to wield swords, Matilda proved they could command something far more enduring, the ground beneath their enemies' feet. Her castles weren't just shelters, they were the physical manifestation of her will, carved into the bedrock of Italy itself. Long after her death, their ruins stood as silent witnesses to a truth that unsettled kings and chroniclers alike. Dominion isn't just about who holds the crown, but who holds the high ground. Blanche of Castile stepped into a swirling storm of rebellion when her husband, Louis VIII, died unexpectedly in 1226, leaving their 12-year-old son as king. Overnight, the queen consort became regent of France, a role no woman had wielded with such absolute authority. The barons, smelling weakness, pounced. They called her the foreign woman, whispering that a Spaniard had no right to rule Frenchmen, but Blanche didn't plead for their loyalty, she outplayed them. With the crown's treasury nearly empty and half the nobility plotting to carve up the kingdom, she turned fragility into strength, her first move exploiting their greed. She bought off the most dangerous rebels with strategic land grants, isolating the rest. Then she played the church against the nobility, securing papal support by framing her regency as divine duty. But Blanche's true genius lay in how she weaponized her son's youth. Where others saw a child's vulnerability, she saw a symbol. Louis IX's innocence became her propaganda tool. Portraits circulated of the boy king kneeling in prayer, his mother's hand resting protectively on his shoulder, a living saint under her guidance. When the Duke of Brittany marched on Paris, Blanche didn't hide behind walls. She rode out to meet him with Louis at her side, forcing the Duke to either attack his anointed king or stand down. He chose the latter. Then came her masterstroke, the Treaty of Vendôme. Instead of crushing the rebellions outright, she negotiated terms that looked like concessions but were actually traps. Letting rebellious lords keep titles in exchange for oaths of allegiance turned their temporary loyalty into permanent dependence. By the time Louis came of age, the barons were too entangled in her web of favors and punishments to challenge him. Yet Blanche's fiercest battle wasn't on the battlefield, it was in the chronicles. Male scribes, uncomfortable with her power, wrote of her as either a domineering shrew or a pious placeholder. They couldn't deny her successes, so they framed them as luck or divine intervention. The truth: she governed with a statesman's cunning and a mother's ruthlessness. When rebellious towns mocked her authority, she starved them into submission. When her own cousin plotted treason, she confiscated his lands without flinching. And when Louis finally took the throne, she didn't relinquish power, she ruled beside him, advising even his crusades. Here's what the histories omit: Blanche's regency didn't just save France, it redefined it. Her legal reforms curbed feudal anarchy, her patronage of universities nurtured a new bureaucratic class, and her insistence on Louis's sainthood in the making laid the groundwork for France's rise as Europe's moral arbiter. The boy king might have worn the crown, but the queen regent forged the kingdom. Blanche of Castile's crown might have rested on her head, but her power flowed from the altar. In an era where queens who ruled alone were viewed with suspicion, she turned piety into her sharpest political weapon. While rebellious barons grumbled about a foreign woman holding the reins of France, Blanche quietly transformed herself into the church's most indispensable ally. She didn't just attend Mass, she staged it, ensuring every royal chapel service doubled as theatre, with her son Louis IX positioned like a living relic at her side. Chroniclers recorded how she wept during sermons, her devotion so palpable that even skeptical bishops found it harder to question her regency when she framed it as holy duty. But Blanche's relationship with the church wasn't just performative, it was transactional. She knew that in medieval Europe, divine approval could silence earthly dissent. When rebel lords threatened to withdraw allegiance, she countersigned papal decrees granting indulgences to those who supported her regency, effectively painting opposition as sacrilege. Her masterstroke, commissioning the Sorbonne's theologians to declare that a mother's guidance was the hand of God shaping a king, suddenly challenging Blanche wasn't just treason, it was heresy. Her alliance with Rome went deeper than propaganda. She funneled royal funds into monastic orders, not out of charity but strategy. Cistercian monasteries, with their sprawling networks of influence, became her intelligence hubs. Abbots reported whispered plots from confessionals, while Dominican friars, indebted to her patronage, preached sermons equating loyalty to the crown with spiritual purity. Even her choice of saints was calculated. She promoted the cult of Saint Denis, France's patron, while quietly elevating Spanish saints like James of Compostela, a subtle nod to her heritage that doubled as a reminder of her pan-European connections. Yet the true test of her religious diplomacy came during the Albigensian Crusade. While her husband had waged war against heretics in southern France, Blanche took a different tack. She offered pardons to repentant Cathar nobles, but only if they swore fealty to her son. It was a brilliant gambit. By positioning herself as both crusader and merciful intercessor, she turned a divisive war into a tool of consolidation. The message was clear: Blanche didn't just defend the faith, she wielded it. The church, in turn, gave her what no army could: legitimacy. Papal bulls hailed her as God's regent, while bishops anointed Louis with oils consecrated in her presence. When critics muttered that a woman couldn't lead, she had Augustine's writings on righteous female rulers read aloud in cathedrals. By the time Louis came of age, Blanche had so thoroughly entwined her authority with divine will that even the most arrogant baron hesitated to defy her. The lesson: in a world where kings ruled by sword and seal, a queen could reign by sacrament and symbol. Anne of Bohemia arrived in England not just with a royal entourage, but with whispered legends trailing behind her. The daughter of Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, she grew up in Prague's glittering court, a hub of alchemical experiments and astrological studies. While English chroniclers dismissed her as a quiet, pious queen, the truth was far more intriguing. Anne's marriage to Richard II in 1382 didn't just unite kingdoms, it smuggled continental mysticism into the heart of London. Courtiers gossiped that her luggage contained forbidden texts, that her ladies-in-waiting practiced strange rituals, and that the queen herself could decipher the secrets of the philosopher's stone. Richard, young and impressionable, fell under her spell not of witchcraft, as his enemies later claimed, but of intellectual curiosity. Together, they turned their court into a sanctuary for thinkers who'd have been burned elsewhere. The Westminster Palace Library swelled with treatises on numerology, celestial magic, and the works of Ramon Llull, a philosopher who claimed to have unlocked the language of angels. When Richard commissioned the Wilton diptych, that hauntingly beautiful altarpiece, he didn't just ask for a religious scene, he demanded hidden symbolism. Scholars still debate the meaning of the 11 angels wearing Richard's badge, but some whisper it mirrored Anne's fascination with sacred numbers and astrological alignments. The real scandal, though, wasn't her interests, it was her influence. In an age when queens were expected to limit themselves to needlework and pious donations, Anne advised Richard on statecraft through the lens of esotericism. She allegedly urged him to time coronation ceremonies with planetary conjunctions, believing it would secure divine favor. When the peasants' revolt erupted in 1381, rumors swirled that she'd predicted the chaos through astrological charts. Even her death in 1394 became fodder for legend. Some claimed she'd foreseen her own end in a dream, while others insisted Richard had tried and failed to use alchemy to save her. But here's where history twists. After Anne's death, Richard's behavior grew erratic. He adopted her mystical leanings without her political caution, surrounding himself with astrologers and claiming divine right with a fervor that alienated the nobility. His opponents weaponized Anne's legacy, painting her as a corrupting force who'd filled the king's head with dangerous ideas. By the time Henry Bolingbroke deposed him in 1399, Richard's obsession with the occult, a passion Anne had once tempered, had become proof of his unfitness to rule. The irony, Anne's true transgression wasn't dabbling in the arcane. It was proving that a queen's mind could be as potent as her husband's sword, and in medieval England that was the most dangerous magic of all. Anne of Bohemia's arrival in England didn't just bring a new queen, it ignited a cultural revolution. The luxurious manuscript she carried in her dowry introduced English scribes to the vibrant colors and intricate gold leafwork of Prague's scriptoria, forever changing the look of royal books. Westminster's illuminators, accustomed to simpler designs, suddenly experimented with whimsical marginalia and jewel-toned miniatures inspired by Bohemian styles. The famous Luttrell Psalter, with its lively scenes of peasant life, might never have existed without this cross-pollination of artistic traditions, but Anne's influence stretched far beyond pretty pages. Her entourage included scholars who'd studied at Charles University in Prague, Europe's first center of higher learning north of the Alps. These thinkers brought radical ideas about education, questioning blind obedience to ancient texts and encouraging observation of the natural world. When Richard II founded Winchester College, whispers circulated that its curriculum echoed Anne's Bohemian ideals: less rote memorization, more debate. Even Chaucer, who served in Richard's court, absorbed these influences. His Parliament of Fowls teems with Bohemian literary motifs, from dream visions to allegorical gardens, a far cry from the straightforward storytelling of earlier English poetry. The Queen's most enduring legacy, though, was her salon culture. In Prague, her father had hosted Europe's greatest minds, from astronomers to poets. Anne recreated this intellectual haven in England, gathering philosophers, musicians, and even Jewish scholars unthinkable in most Christian courts. Her patronage nurtured England's first stirrings of humanism, decades before the Italian Renaissance reached its shores. Theologians like John Wycliffe found unexpected protection under her wing, despite his controversial translations of the Bible into English. Some historians argue that without Anne's Bohemian tolerance, Lollardy, the precursor to Protestantism, might have been crushed before gaining traction. Perhaps the clearest proof of her cultural impact lies in what happened after her death. The stunning Wilton diptych, commissioned by Richard in her memory, blends English and Bohemian artistic traditions so seamlessly that scholars still debate its origins. And when Henry IV deposed Richard, one of his first acts was purging the court of Bohemian advisors, a tacit admission of how thoroughly Anne's cosmopolitan vision had reshaped England. For a brief, glittering moment, this foreign queen had turned an island kingdom into a bridge between worlds, proving that culture could be a more potent legacy than any crown. Joan of Navarre's wealth made her a target long before the whispers of witchcraft began. As Duchess of Brittany and later Queen Consort of England through her marriage to Henry IV, she controlled lands and revenues that dwarfed the crown's own treasury. But it wasn't until her stepson Henry V ascended the throne in 1413 that her fortunes turned sinister. The new king, desperate to fund his campaigns in France, eyed Joan's Breton estates and the staggering £30,000, nearly half of England's annual income, she'd inherited from her late husband. Yet seizing a queen dowager's assets outright would spark outrage. So Henry chose a darker path. He weaponized superstition. The accusations exploded in 1419, just as Henry prepared for his pivotal siege of Rouen. Joan was arrested without warning, charged with conspiring to kill the king through sorcery. The specifics were absurd. She'd allegedly commissioned wax effigies of Henry to be melted over slow fires, a classic witch's curse. Never mind that Joan had funded his wars and raised his half-siblings as her own. Henry's prosecutors paraded witnesses, former servants paid to swear they'd seen her muttering incantations or collecting herbs under a full moon. The trial was a sham, no evidence was presented, and Joan wasn't permitted to speak in her defense. Within weeks, she was stripped of her property and imprisoned in Leeds Castle, where she'd remain for 3 years. What makes Joan's case chilling isn't just the blatant greed behind it, it's how meticulously Henry exploited cultural fears. By 1419, Europe was simmering with witch panic. The Church had begun classifying witchcraft as heresy, and Henry's own allies were fanning the flames. Bishop Henry Beaufort, his uncle and chief moneylender, had recently presided over heresy trials. By tying Joan to this rising hysteria, Henry transformed a financial grab into a holy crusade. The message was clear: questioning the seizure of her wealth became tantamount to defending a heretic. Yet the true brilliance of Henry's scheme lay in its timing. With the nation fixated on his glorious campaigns in France, Joan's arrest barely caused a ripple. Chroniclers dependent on royal patronage either ignored the incident or repeated the official line. Even Shakespeare, writing centuries later, glossed over it, proof of how thoroughly Henry controlled the narrative. Joan's eventual release in 1422 came only after Henry had drained her coffers dry. She emerged broken, her health ruined, forced to sign away any claim to her estates in exchange for a meager pension. The witchcraft charges were quietly dropped, but the stain never faded. In the end, Henry didn't just steal Joan's wealth. He stole her legacy, ensuring history would remember her as a cautionary tale rather than one of medieval England's most formidable financial minds. The cruelest twist: the same son who'd orchestrated her downfall would later invoke her name to bolster his own piety, praying at her tomb before Agincourt. Joan's story wasn't just about witchcraft, it was a masterclass in how power rewrites truth. Joan of Navarre didn't just inherit wealth, she built an economic web that stretched across the English Channel, turning the Breton salt trade into her personal empire. Salt was the medieval equivalent of oil, a precious commodity used to preserve food, pay soldiers, and even treat wounds. While most nobles relied on rents from land, Joan controlled the salt pans of Guérande, a coastal region in Brittany where seawater evaporated into mountains of white gold. These weren't just local markets, her agents shipped Breton salt as far as Flanders and Scandinavia, skimming profits at every port. But Joan's brilliance lay in how she leveraged this monopoly. When her second husband, Henry IV of England, struggled to fund his shaky reign, she didn't just give him money, she loaned it, securing repayment through customs duties on wool exports. Suddenly, the Queen held England's most lucrative trade by the purse strings. Her financial network operated like a shadow treasury. Breton merchants advancing funds to the crown would be repaid not in coin, but in trading privileges, exclusive rights to sell salt in English ports, or priority access to Welsh wool. This created a self-perpetuating cycle. The more Joan funded Henry's wars, the tighter her grip on cross-channel commerce became. Records from 1408 show her personally negotiating with Hanseatic League representatives, diverting Baltic timber shipments to bolster Henry's navy in exchange for lifting tariffs on Breton goods. It was diplomacy disguised as business, and Joan excelled at both. Yet her most daring move came during the Glyndŵr Rebellion in Wales. When Henry's troops ran out of funds, Joan stepped in with a solution. She'd advance the money, but repayment would come from future control of Welsh silver mines. The mines never produced as promised, but the deal revealed her long game, tying royal survival to her financial infrastructure. By the time Henry died in 1413, Joan held liens on everything from Cornish tin revenues to the profits of London's spice markets. The bitter irony, this very web of wealth made her a target. Henry V didn't just accuse Joan of witchcraft to seize her assets. He needed to dismantle a financial system that had become too powerful to control. Her Breton salt syndicates threatened his new alliances with French rivals, while her network of creditors gave her influence over the very nobles he relied on. Joan's real crime wasn't magic, it was proving that a queen's purse could wield more power than a king's sword, and in a world where money moved armies, that made her the most dangerous woman in Europe. Philippa of Hainault didn't just wear the crown, she carried the weight of England's gratitude on her shoulders. Born in what's now Belgium, she arrived in England as a teenage bride to Edward III in 1328, a foreign princess in a kingdom simmering with resentment toward outsiders. Yet within a decade, she'd become the most beloved queen since Eleanor of Aquitaine, and her secret wasn't conquest, it was compassion. While other monarchs ruled with an iron fist, Philippa wielded something far more potent, empathy dressed as policy. Take the Siege of Calais in 1347, a defining moment of the 100 Years' War. After Edward's forces starved the French-held city into surrender, he vowed to execute 6 leading citizens as retribution. The chronicler Froissart paints the scene, burghers kneeling in the mud, nooses around their necks, when Philippa, heavy with her 14th child, threw herself at Edward's feet. "My lord," she pleaded, "if you deny me this mercy, history will remember your cruelty longer than your victory." It wasn't just theatrical, it was politically masterful. By granting the pardon, she transformed Edward from a vengeful conqueror into a magnanimous ruler with herself as the catalyst. Overnight, ballads celebrated her intervention, turning foreign resistance into domestic adoration. But Philippa's genius lay in her economic policies, particularly with England's wool trade. Recognizing that merchants were the kingdom's lifeblood, she became their champion. When Flemish weavers revolted against English wool tariffs, she didn't send troops, she invited their leaders to tea. Fluent in their dialect and familiar with their grievances, her Hainault roots bordered Flanders. She negotiated a compromise that kept looms humming and tariffs flowing. Soon, English wool merchants were naming ships after her, and her likeness appeared on trade guild seals, a queen literally stamped on the backbone of the economy. Her domestic reforms were just as revolutionary. When plague-ravaged villages couldn't pay taxes, she convinced Edward to cancel their debts. When London's streets flooded in 1339, she funded the first public drainage system. Even her patronage of scholars had a populist twist. She established a Flemish weaving school for English women, turning a luxury craft into a ladder for social mobility. Chroniclers marveled at her common touch, like the time she joined peasant women in the fields during harvest, her sleeves rolled up, laughing as she bundled wheat. The irony, Philippa's foreignness became her greatest asset. Where English nobility distrusted outsiders, the common people saw a queen who understood hunger, who spoke their dialects, who valued sweat as much as silk. While Edward waged war abroad, she waged peace at home, proving that the softest power, a kind word, a cancelled debt, a spared life, could bind a nation tighter than any victory on the battlefield. When she died in 1369, London's markets shuttered voluntarily, an unprecedented tribute for a queen who'd ruled not from a gilded throne, but from the hearts of those she called "my people." Philippa of Hainault's greatest literary legacy might not be in the laws she influenced or the chronicles she inspired, but in the quiet patronage she gave to a young customs officer named Geoffrey Chaucer. While history remembers Chaucer as the father of English poetry, few realize his career might never have blossomed without Philippa's intervention. Her sister was married to Chaucer's father, linking the poet to court circles through family ties, but Philippa did far more than offer nepotism. She became Chaucer's silent collaborator, providing the financial stability and political cover he needed to experiment with England's vulgar tongue at a time when Latin and French still dominated serious writing. Look closely at the Canterbury Tales, and Philippa's fingerprints appear everywhere. The wife of Bath, that boisterous, gap-toothed weaver who dominates the tales with her unapologetic sexuality, might have been modeled after Flemish women from Philippa's own court. The character's famous diatribe on female sovereignty echoes Philippa's own quiet campaign to expand women's legal rights, including her successful push to recognize wives as co-owners of marital property. Even the pilgrimage framework of the Canterbury Tales mirrors Philippa's own well-documented devotion to Thomas Becket's shrine, a site she visited annually with her flax-spinning entourage. But the real intrigue lies in Chaucer's subtle subversions. When he describes the prioress speaking French after the Scole of Stratford-a-Tebow, a deliberately provincial dialect, it's a wink at Philippa's own multilingual court, where Flemish, French, and English blended freely. The idealized Knight's Tale, with its themes of chivalric mercy, parallels Philippa's famous intercession at Calais. Some scholars even argue the unfinished state of the Canterbury Tales hints at darker currents. As Philippa's influence waned in the 1360s due to illness, so too did Chaucer's protection. His later works grow noticeably more ambiguous, as if the loss of his royal patron forced him to cloak criticism in thicker layers of irony. What makes Philippa's role extraordinary is how she nurtured literature without demanding flattery. Unlike later monarchs who commissioned works to burnish their images, she created an environment where Chaucer could mock corrupt friars, lusty millers, and even the aristocracy itself. Her court became England's first literary salon, where a wool merchant's son could rewrite the rules of storytelling. The result, a masterpiece that didn't just entertain, it gave voice to the butcher, the widow, and the student alongside the knight, turning the cacophony of medieval England into art. Philippa didn't just sponsor a poet, she midwifed a language. Melisende of Jerusalem wasn't just handed a crown, she fought for it with the same ferocity as any Crusader knight. Born in 1105 to Baldwin II of Jerusalem and his Armenian queen, Morphia, she was raised in a world where bloodlines and battlefields determined power. When her father died in 1131, he didn't leave the kingdom to her younger brother or a distant male relative. He named Melisende his heir, ruling alongside her husband, Fulk of Anjou. But this wasn't some ceremonial title. Baldwin had seen his daughter's sharp mind firsthand, watching her navigate the treacherous politics of the Crusader states with a mix of grace and steel. From the moment she took the throne, Melisende made it clear she wouldn't be a figurehead. The first test came from her own husband. Fulk, a seasoned warrior who'd expected to rule alone, bristled at sharing power. He stacked the court with his Angevin allies, sidelining Melisende's loyalists, and even tried to erase her name from official documents. But Melisende didn't retreat to her chambers. She struck back by rallying the native barons, men who distrusted Fulk's foreign cronies and the church, reminding them that her lineage traced back to Jerusalem's earliest conquerors. When Fulk's supporters whispered that a woman couldn't lead, she let her actions speak louder. She presided over courts, issued charters in her own name, and even intervened in military campaigns, proving her command extended beyond palace walls. The tension reached its peak when Fulk's own knights allegedly plotted to assassinate her allies. Instead of cowering, Melisende confronted him publicly, forcing Fulk to kneel in penance before the Patriarch of Jerusalem. It was a humiliation he never recovered from, and a warning to anyone who underestimated her. But her greatest battle erupted after Fulk's death in 1143. Though her son Baldwin III was old enough to rule, Melisende refused to surrender authority. The kingdom, fractured by crusader factions and surrounded by enemies, needed her steady hand. Baldwin, however, had other ideas. Encouraged by young nobles eager for war and glory, he demanded full control. What followed wasn't just a family quarrel, it was a civil war. Baldwin raised an army, seizing key fortresses, while Melisende fortified Jerusalem itself, her supporters flooding the streets. The clash wasn't merely about power, it was a referendum on whether a woman could hold the throne in a realm perpetually at war. Melisende's genius lay in her ability to wield both soft and hard power. While Baldwin besieged cities, she turned to diplomacy, securing the backing of the church and the powerful Ibelin family. When Baldwin took Jerusalem by force in 1152, she didn't flee or beg for mercy. She negotiated. The settlement they reached was revolutionary. Melisende kept control of Nablus, the kingdom's richest region, and remained co-ruler in all but name. Even in retreat, she retained influence, advising Baldwin until her death in 1161. What's often overlooked is how Melisende's reign reshaped Jerusalem's identity. While Crusader kings obsessed with reconquering lost lands, she invested in the kingdom's soul, rebuilding the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, commissioning illuminated manuscripts that blended Byzantine and Latin styles, and fostering a rare tolerance between Frankish settlers and local Christians. In a world where queens were expected to pray quietly, Melisende proved they could rule and redefine an empire. Her legacy wasn't just in the battles she won, but in the vision she left behind. A Jerusalem where power didn't always wear a crown, but could flourish behind a queen's unyielding gaze. Melisende's buildings weren't just stone and mortar, they were manifestos in architecture, designed to stitch together a fractured kingdom with every carved arch and painted fresco. Take the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, her crowning restoration project after its dome collapsed in 1149. While previous Crusader kings had simply patched up damage, Melisende orchestrated a radical transformation. She merged soaring Latin arches with delicate Byzantine mosaics, creating a space where Eastern and Western Christianity could coexist under one roof. The message was unmistakable. Jerusalem wasn't just a Frankish conquest, it was a shared inheritance. Even the workers she hired sent a signal. Instead of importing European craftsmen, she employed local Armenian and Syrian artisans, their techniques weaving Levantine traditions into the very fabric of Christendom's holiest site. But her boldest statement lay in the Abbey of St. Lazarus at Bethany, built for her sister Iveta. Here, Melisende flipped the script on traditional monastic design. Most convents were modest, hidden away, but this complex sprawled like a palace, its scriptoria producing illuminated manuscripts that fused Latin liturgy with Coptic binding styles. The cloister walls featured frescoes of Old Testament heroines like Deborah and Jael, warrior women who defended their people. And in a stroke of genius, Melisende positioned the abbey as the final stop for pilgrims before Jerusalem, ensuring travelers would witness her vision of female authority before reaching the holy city. Then there were her fortresses. At Crac des Chevaliers, expansions she ordered included curiously domestic touches, intricate plasterwork in the chapel, a vaulted bread oven in the kitchens, subtly asserting that even in war, a queen's touch brought refinement. But the masterstroke was the Tower of David's renovations, where Frankish lords typically built keeps as blunt symbols of power. Melisende added a graceful ambulatory lined with relics. Visitors ascending to the ramparts would pass saintly bones before seeing the kingdom stretched below, a spiritual journey before a military one. The brilliance of these projects wasn't just their beauty, it was their diplomacy. In a land perpetually torn between Crusader barons, Eastern Christians, and Muslim neighbors, Melisend's buildings spoke a language everyone understood. Her Armenian heritage shone through in the geometric floor tiles of the Holy Sepulchre, a nod to her mother's lineage. The Frankish towers bore fleur-de-lis carvings, legitimizing her Angevin husband's lineage, while her own name dominated the foundation stones. Even the gardens she planted at every site carried meaning. Medicinal herbs from Europe grew alongside date palms from the Jordan Valley, a living metaphor for her reign. What historians often miss is how these structures became tools of soft conquest. While male rulers waged costly campaigns to subdue rebellious towns, Melisende simply built a hospital here, a chapel there, until her influence was literally set in stone. When Baldwin III finally wrested power from her, he couldn't dismantle her legacy without tearing down half the kingdom. Long after her death, pilgrims would marvel at the Queen's hand in Jerusalem's skyline, proving that in a world of clashing swords, the quiet authority of a fresco or a vaulted ceiling could outlast any battlefield victory. Urraca of León didn't just inherit a crown, she inherited a powder keg. When her father, Alfonso VI, died in 1109, he left her a fractured kingdom teetering on the edge of civil war. León and Castile were united under her rule, but the nobility bristled at the idea of a woman wielding absolute power. Urraca's response: she married a man even more volatile than her enemies, Alfonso I of Aragon, known as the Battler. On paper, it was a strategic masterstroke uniting two Christian kingdoms against the Moorish south, but in reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Alfonso viewed marriage as a merger, not a partnership. He demanded control of Urraca's lands, alienated her nobles with his abrasive style, and even seized cities without her consent. Within months, their union became less a political alliance and more a battlefield. The Pope himself intervened, scandalized by rumors of their violent clashes. Chroniclers whispered that Alfonso struck Urraca, that she fled his court in the dead of night, that their quarrels turned diplomatic meetings into shouting matches. By 1112, the marriage was annulled not on grounds of politics but consanguinity, a thinly veiled excuse to end what had become a public spectacle. Yet the real surprise wasn't the divorce, it was what Urraca did next. Instead of retreating, she doubled down on her authority. She reclaimed every fortress Alfonso had taken, outmaneuvering him militarily despite his reputation as a fearsome warrior. When he retaliated by besieging her cities, she turned his own allies against him, leveraging their resentment of his arrogance. But Urraca's reign wasn't defined by her failed marriage alone. She faced rebellions from her own son, Alfonso VII, who'd been named heir by her late father. Nobles exploited the tension, playing mother against son in a bitter power struggle. Yet Urraca refused to be sidelined. She negotiated truces with Moorish taifas to secure her southern borders, flouting the Church's demands for perpetual holy war. She even leveraged her excommunication, a punishment for defying papal orders, to her advantage, using it to portray herself as a defiant underdog fighting against foreign interference. What makes Urraca's story so compelling isn't just her defiance, but her adaptability. She ruled for 17 turbulent years, not by brute force, but by knowing when to fight and when to outthink her opponents. When chroniclers labeled her weak for compromising with Muslims, she ignored them. Her kingdom survived. When priests condemned her for annulling her marriage, she shrugged. Her power remained intact. Urraca understood something her detractors didn't. In a world that saw queens as either saints or sinners, the most radical act was simply refusing to play by their rules. By the time she died in 1126, she'd left a legacy far more enduring than any scandal, a throne that, against all odds, still belonged to her. Urraca of León didn't just fight battles, she rewrote the rulebook. In a world where noblewomen's lands routinely vanished into their husbands' coffers, Urraca issued a decree that sent shockwaves through 12th century Europe. No woman, whether queen or commoner, could be stripped of her inheritance by marriage. This wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a seismic shift in medieval law. Her 1115 charter, known as the Fuero de León, explicitly guaranteed daughters the right to inherit and control property even after wedlock. Imagine the audacity, a queen using her own turbulent marriage as proof that women needed legal armor. What made Urraca's reforms revolutionary wasn't just their content, it was their enforcement. While earlier rulers paid lip service to women's rights, she built mechanisms to uphold them. Local magistrates received strict orders to void any contract that bypassed female heirs, with penalties so harsh even powerful barons hesitated to interfere. When her own cousin tried to seize his sister's estate near Burgos, Urraca didn't just rule against him. She confiscated his lands as an example. Soon, her courts were flooded with cases from peasant women claiming stolen vineyards and widows demanding their dower right back from greedy in-laws. For the first time, the law wasn't just protecting queens, it was listening to seamstresses and shepherds' daughters. But the real genius lay in how she framed these changes. Urraca tied women's inheritance to the survival of the realm itself. In charters, she argued that disinheriting daughters weakened the kingdom by scattering loyalties. After all, a woman robbed of her birthright might marry a foreigner to reclaim status. It was a masterstroke, turning a moral argument into a patriotic one. Even the church, usually wary of female autonomy, endorsed her reforms when she pledged to donate reclaimed lands to monasteries. The ripple effects lasted centuries. Urraca's laws became the blueprint for Alfonso X's Syed Partidas, the legal code that would shape Spain's golden age. More remarkably, her precedents trickled beyond the Pyrenees, influencing Eleanor of Aquitaine's own inheritance battles in France. And here's the twist: while male rulers like Henry I of England were still imprisoning heiresses to control their estates, Urraca's court scribes were meticulously recording testimony from illiterate peasant women about stolen sheep. That contrast between brute force and bureaucratic fairness shows the true scale of her revolution. Yet the most telling detail survives in a tiny lawsuit from 1123. A widow named Maria won back her mill from a knight who'd seized it, citing the Queen's law as her shield. The court transcript notes the knight's furious protest, then casually mentions he paid his fine in honey and wax, as if even the mightiest couldn't escape Urraca's justice. That mill still stands today, its stones worn smooth by centuries of grain, just like Urraca's legacy, unassuming, enduring, and built to feed the future. The quietest weapons in a medieval queen's arsenal weren't daggers or poison, they were whispers slipped into the right ears at the right moment. While kings relied on armies, queens mastered the art of the invisible network, weaving webs of informants that stretched from castle kitchens to foreign courts. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine's infamous Court of Love. In Poitiers, beneath its veneer of poetry and romance, it functioned as a brilliant intelligence hub. Troubadours didn't just sing ballads, they carried coded messages between allies, their verses laced with political cues. A line about a faithless nightingale might warn of a traitorous baron, while a lament for a withered rose could signal an ailing pope. These musicians traveled freely between courts, their art granting them access even to rival territories, where they'd return with details of troop movements or marital discord ripe for exploitation. But the true specialists in royal espionage were often the most overlooked. Ladies-in-waiting, dismissed as mere companions, were perfect spies, trusted to handle correspondence, overhear private counsels, and even rifle through drawers unnoticed. Isabella of France employed her maids to intercept letters between her husband Edward II and his despised favorite, Hugh Despenser. When the king ordered heightened security, her women simply switched tactics, stitching intercepted messages into the hems of gowns or hiding them in hollow prayer beads. Other queens relied on merchants, whose trade routes doubled as intelligence pipelines. Margaret of Anjou's silk suppliers from Italy smuggled encrypted notes inside bolts of fabric. their invoices laced with invisible ink made from lemon juice or milk. The most sophisticated networks, though, operated through the church. Abbesses and nuns, enjoying unparalleled freedom of movement, became pivotal couriers for queens like Blanche of Castile. Convents considered neutral ground hosted secret meetings, while pilgrimages provided cover for agents to cross borders. One of Blanche's cleverest moves was planting a scribe in the scriptorium of Fontevraud Abbey, where he copied sensitive documents under the guise of devotional work. Meanwhile, Matilda of Tuscany's spies infiltrated the papal court itself, with one cardinal's housekeeper reportedly paid to collect discarded drafts of encyclicals, revealing which nobles were falling out of favor with Rome. Decoding these missives required equal parts cunning and creativity. Queens employed cipher systems ranging from simple letter substitutions like Christina of Sweden's displaced alphabet to elaborate symbol-based codes resembling astrological charts. Anne of Bohemia favored a book cipher where numbers referenced specific pages and lines in a shared text, often a psalter or chronicle, the real stroke of genius. Many queens deliberately leaked fake correspondence, knowing it would be intercepted. Joan of Navarre once fed false details about troop deployments to a disloyal servant, then watched as her enemies walked straight into an ambush. What made these networks so formidable wasn't just their secrecy, it was their deniability. When accusations flew, queens could shrug. A lute player's gossip or a nun's pious letter hardly constituted evidence. Unlike kings, whose spies were often known agents, queens blurred the lines between courtly ritual and covert operation. A gift of perfumed gloves might carry a hidden plea for aid, while a feast-seating arrangement could telegraph alliances. In a world where women's voices were routinely suppressed, they turned the act of listening into supreme authority, proving that the lightest touch often held the deadliest grip. The goblet of wine looked no different than any other gold-rimmed, glinting in the torchlight, but the man who drank from it collapsed before dessert was served. Poison was the medieval queen's most discreet weapon, a silent equalizer in a world where brute force belonged to men. While kings swung swords, queens perfected the art of the untraceable death, turning banquets into battlegrounds and apothecaries into allies. History records whispers of royal women who mastered toxicology, from the notorious inheritance powders of Italy to the venom-tipped needles hidden in Byzantine hairpins. Take Catherine de' Medici, the Florentine queen who ruled France through her sons. Venetian ambassadors wrote of her Italian methods, a euphemism for her rumored poison cabinet. Though no smoking vial ever surfaced, her enemies died with alarming regularity, like Jeanne d'Albret, the Protestant Queen of Navarre, who succumbed to a mysterious illness after wearing a gift of perfumed gloves from Catherine's workshop. Then there was the sudden demise of Charles IX's political rivals, all stricken with violent stomach ailments after palace dinners. Modern forensic historians note that Catherine's personal library included manuscripts on herbalism, with entire chapters dedicated to the uses of aconite and belladonna. But alleged poisoners didn't always leave such obvious trails. Isabella of France, the she-wolf who deposed her husband Edward II, faced persistent rumors that she disposed of him with a special candle whose fumes induced fatal suffocation. While chroniclers debated the method, some said a red-hot poker, others a suffocating mattress. The real clue lies in Edward's prison cell at Berkeley Castle. Guards reported his food was tested by tasters for weeks, yet he perished anyway, suggesting something far subtler than crude violence. The deadliest poisons, though, were those everyone saw but couldn't prove. In 10th century Constantinople, Empress Theodora allegedly dispatched a rival by gifting her a seemingly harmless beauty cream laced with cantharidin, a blistering agent that seeped into the bloodstream. The victim lingered for days as her organs failed, while Theodora publicly mourned, hosting physicians at the bedside to ease her suffering. Similarly, Eleanor of Aquitaine's rebellious barons had a habit of expiring after dining with her loyalists, their deaths blamed on bad shellfish or summer fevers. Yet Eleanor's personal physician, a Jewish scholar from Cordoba, was known to have translated Arabic treatises on arsenic's tasteless properties. Not all accusations held water, many were pure slander. Anne Boleyn, condemned for witchcraft and poisoning Henry VIII's predecessors, was almost certainly framed, her alleged crimes a pretext for her removal. But the sheer prevalence of these tales reveals a deeper truth. Poison was the ultimate patriarchal nightmare, a weapon that required no physical strength, only patience and plausible deniability. In an age where a queen's open defiance meant ruin, a well-timed illness could rewrite succession without bloodshed. The most chilling cases are those lost to time, like the white powder plot against Maria of Castile, where 3 of her ladies-in-waiting confessed under torture to slipping something into her rival's wine. The records abruptly end there, the recipe never revealed. Perhaps that's why these stories endure. Unlike battles or treaties, poison leaves no monuments, just a whisper, a sudden silence, and a throne conveniently empty. From the shadowed corridors of Poitiers to the blood-stained battlefields of the Wars of the Roses, one truth echoes across these stories. Medieval queens didn't just survive their eras, they reshaped them. Their weapons weren't always swords, sometimes they were ledgers, architectural blueprints, or even carefully chosen words whispered in the right ear. What unites figures as different as Eleanor's political poetry and Margaret's battlefield commands is a relentless refusal to accept the roles history assigned them. These women turned their supposed weaknesses, gender, foreignness, even scandal into instruments of power, proving that reinvention was the ultimate survival tactic. Take a closer look at the patterns. When Matilda of Tuscany's castles were besieged, she built higher walls. When Urraca of León's laws were challenged, she enforced them with ruthless precision. And when Joan of Navarre's wealth was stolen, she outmaneuvered her enemies from a prison cell. Their resilience wasn't passive endurance, it was a conscious act of rewriting the rules. Even the smears meant to destroy them, which adulterous she-wolf became tools. Isabella of France embraced her she-wolf moniker, wielding it as proof of her strength, while Anne of Bohemia let rumors of mysticism cloak her intellectual revolutions. But here's the haunting question: how many more of these stories have been erased, buried under the dust of biased chronicles? For every Eleanor or Margaret we know, there are dozens whose names survive only as footnotes. Queens like Petronilla of Aragon, who governed a kingdom from a convent, or Melissen's lesser-known sister Iveta, whose abbey may have been a front for diplomatic intrigue. The fragments we have are tantalizing. A single line in a monastic ledger about a queen's unusual interest in herbal medicine. A fresco scrap showing a woman in armor, hastily painted over. These breadcrumbs suggest a hidden history, one where women's influence wasn't the exception but the unspoken rule. So let's turn the final page, or rather, pry it open. These queens didn't just leave behind castles and laws, they left blueprints for how to wield power when the deck is stacked against you, their greatest lesson. That resilience isn't about weathering storms but steering them. Now it's your turn. Which of these queens deserves her own series? The strategist, the warrior, the financier, or someone we've yet to fully uncover? Comment below. The archives are waiting and the secrets aren't done whispering.